All right, let's get started, everyone. Welcome. We are here to talk about resiliency and cybersecurity in IT and OT convergence. Here with us is Delenela, Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer from Entergy. Carol Johnston, Vice President from Energy Utilities Resources, IFS, and John Miri, President and CEO of Electric Grid and Cybersecurity Alliance. Welcome and thank you for joining me. I want to start off with a question that is directed for all of you, but I want to start with you, Carol. From your perspective, could you tell us why this topic is important and where are we now in the industry in terms of IT and OT conversions and cybersecurity?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for coming, everyone. I know everybody hears security and they, eyes roll back, and everybody thinks this can be a pretty dry topic. But to me, I think this is one of the most compelling events that's happening not only in the utility industry but in other industries as well. We all talk about the electrification of the grid and the digital transformation that's happening, but there's a big paradigm shift that's happening in the security landscape as well. And I like to break, when I talk, buzzwords and talk about landscapes, breaking that down. To me, that means sort of three main components that's transforming this discussion. And the first one is all about the actors. The second is all about the impact and or the motivation of those actors and how that's impacting this industry. And the third is the surface or the vulnerability points that are being created, and it creates that perfect storm of security discussions and concerns. But let's break it down and start with the actors. So there's been three main actors that are evolving or emerging as we look at this topic or this trend, and it used to all be about hackers. The 15-year-old pimply guy in the basement. They've been kind of romanticized through history. There's a lot of movies that are made about the hacker. A lot of their motivation was around street creds or being able to prove how smart they are, and they would go after the NASAs of the world and be on the headlines for how smart they were. And over time, that's emerged, and this has become more of a business on both the security front, but also the attack front, the cyber attack front. And we started to see actual criminal organizations getting involved. So people that the main motivation was money, right? This was an opportunity for them to make some money with a little amount of effort. So we started to see, large scale, more sophisticated attacks coming forward. We all learned not to click or give money to the Nigerian prince, or if you're older generation, your grandson is probably not in jail and needs bail money immediately. But the sophistication of these criminal organizations, the more money they make, the more of these actors that have come forward. But finally, now we're starting to see state and government organizations getting involved. And we can look no farther than the Ukrainian grid to see examples of not only the first whole-scale cyber attack against a utility, but now also a physical attack with the Russian invasion that's happening. So the sophistication and the players, the people that are getting involved are really upping their game, and the utility has to do the same. And then finally, we look at the surface or the vulnerability points. And, I think we heard yesterday with Sean talking from GE, those that saw his keynote, he was talking about the landscape or the surface point of the utility, the grid expanding. It's no longer regional or localized, it's global. And we're starting to see, after COVID, we're all working remotely. We all become a vulnerability point. We've got the Internet of Things or smart assets connected to the grid. These are all touch points or areas of penetration and exposure that are getting more and more diverse as well. So I think that's why we're all here talking about this. And I really don't see it just as an IT problem. It's an operational problem as well.
Thank you, John.
Sure. So I'll give you first off just a little idea of my perspective. So I've spent about 25 years in technology and cybersecurity and about the last decade in utilities. And prior to my role now with the Electric Grid Cybersecurity Alliance, I was Chief Administrative Officer at LCRA, which is a wholesale power and water utility in Austin. I remember a tour, when you talk about IT and OT security, I remember a tour of a power plant that I went through about a decade ago. And keep in mind, at that point, I'm coming out of the software industry, just getting into the utility industry. So we walk through the turbines and all this other stuff. And I'm like a kid in a candy store. It's like first day of school, right? What is this? What is that? No idea what we're going, what we're looking at. We walk into the control room and I see the control system. And I'm like, I'm home, boys. This is a computer. because there's racks and racks of Dell servers with blue Ethernet cables connected to the back of them. As soon as I said that, the plant manager said, "That is not a computer." And I was like, "Looks like a computer. It's got Dell logos on the front. I think that's IT." "No, that's a control system." And I said, "Well, is the control system software?" "Well, yeah." "Does it run on a server?" "Yeah." "What operating system is it?" "Windows." "Okay, that sounds like IT to me." And what I found over time was the borders between those things are really converging. And in a sense, it's not that they're merging. One of the best things you can do in OT cybersecurity is to isolate your OT networks from your IT networks. So I'm not advocating that you connect them. But the people and the skill sets and the technologies are showing up in either column. And it's becoming a little difficult to even tell the difference anymore. So I think when it comes to IT and cybersecurity, OT and cybersecurity, you really got to take a comprehensive approach. The first question I had in that role from the chair of the audit committee of the board was, because in that role I had cybersecurity, but also IT. The first question from the chair of our audit committee was brilliant. And she said, do your cybersecurity folks have jurisdiction over just the IT stuff that you run or all the technology? And when I said all the technology, she was really happy about that. And that's not something that you have to do, but I think it's something that is really a best practice, is to take a very integrated approach. It really doesn't matter how they break in or what they break in order to get in. If they take something down, we're all out of business. So that resilience as a goal really involves looking at IT and OT. Interesting little debate on LinkedIn this last weekend, where a very smart ICS expert actually laid the claim out that there is no such thing as IT-OT convergence. And I think if you hear that from folks, and what we were seeing in that case is that some people are so siloed that they don't really see the convergence happening. So when I poked the guy and said, "But don't you use computers?" "Well, yeah." "Don't you use IP-based networks?" "Yeah." "Don't you use Java and Windows and things like that?" "Yeah, but that's just the next generation of OT. That's not IT." It doesn't matter, right? The words are all getting mixed up. The technologies are getting mixed up, and we've got to take a comprehensive look at both of them.
Thank you. I want to hear from you, Anne.
Yeah, no, great commentary from both members here. I'll just add maybe a perspective through a story, and that's through the Colonial Pipeline hack. I'm sure that you have heard of that hack. I remember when that occurred, we had a quick phone call from our CEO, we had a quick phone call from our board members asking about the risk and how did this happen to a company like Colonial Pipeline. This is how it happened. There was a VPN account that did not have multi-factor authentication, that the credentials, the password for that VPN account was discovered through some other means. So someone may have used, the same credentials in multiple places. That's actually how they got in. So think about that. You have accounts, you have IDs, and you have passwords. You're probably thinking, there's no way my stuff is going to impact operations that can take down the whole gas operations, that can cause lines at the gas stations, that can cause national security concern, where Biden is now addressing this. So when we talk about IT-OT convergence, it's as simple as that. It's really as simple as the reality that anything that's digital, anything that's digitized, as John had mentioned, anything like that is going to have a cybersecurity component. Your Internet of Things in your home, your refrigerator that wants to talk to the internet and give you your grocery list when you're at the grocery store, or tell you when you're out of milk. That's a cybersecurity risk. So that convergence actually is occurring now. I don't think it's even discussion anymore, and kind of surprised. I didn't see that discussion on LinkedIn, but I'm kind of surprised that there's that thought that there is a separation. We may think that there, and I've had plenty of great conversations with my OT peers about having, oh, we have diodes, we have air gaps, you know, we have things in place, we're protected. And so I told you the story about Colonial Pipeline. You know, there is, gosh, I mean, we have, Carol had mentioned the Ukraine hack. There have been so many actually where there have been supposed air gaps, and yet there's still an opportunity into those environments. So you know, it's the OT convergence. It's here. It's happening. We have to make sure that we come together to address it. So I'm going to say one more thing. I love the fact I sat in on a resiliency discussion just earlier. And none of the folks on that resiliency panel were CISOs or cyber, but they all talked cyber. And I loved that. I mean, we have a prior regulator. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but I love the fact that she was mentioning something like that. And so it's here now. We have to make sure that we can be that bridge for these very important topics for what we do.
Absolutely. John, could you walk us through the differences and similarities of cybersecurity in both spaces, the IT and OT?
Sure. So there are very few people, unfortunately, that you can hire at this point that have experience on both sides. And that's okay. I think that's something we have to kind of accept at first and, you know, hire people who have background in maybe one or the other and bring them to the other. But as you mentioned, there are some very big differences between how they work. In the IT world, the technology changes much more quickly and is designed to be patched automatically with software changes in a much easier way. So asset management, asset identification, when you identify a vulnerability, it's much easier in an IT environment to get that patched. I remember when a lot of our folks who had come out of the IT background started looking at OT networks and noticing things like, you know, really old operating systems or things like that. So they run VAT scans, they find some of these vulnerabilities, and the first reaction for someone who comes out of the IT world is if you have a vulnerability, just patch it. Well, just patch it might mean upgrading the control system, and you just don't do that every 15 minutes. We've taken some cues from the healthcare world where in utilities, OT is stable, much more stable than typical IT. In the healthcare world, all of those medical devices have to go through clinical trials with the FDA. So you can identify a problem, but you can't just go change the software. If that device that distributes, you know, chemotherapy dosages was vetted by the FDA, you can't just upgrade the software. And we have that problem a lot inside of the OT environments. What we tried to do to bring people together is to take a step back and say, we're not trying to apply OT operations procedures to the IT world, and we're not trying to apply IT cybersecurity to the OT world. What we've got to do is take a step back, respect the differences, and focus on the goal, which is increasing reliability. So if I could magically get millions and millions of dollars to upgrade a power plant control system every year, I wouldn't even want to do it because the reliability in your first year of operation is pretty low, or lower than you're going to get till you get to some real level of stability. So I think that's one of the biggest differences is that the technology works in a very significantly different way, and you really need to adapt your techniques to respect that. What works in an IT environment just doesn't always work in an OT environment.
Thank you. And the industry is adopting or integrating emerging technologies at an accelerated rate, as you know. How does that impact IT and OT convergence and cybersecurity from a global perspective? And I also want to add to that, how can the industry or industry leaders ensure their assets are secure while collaborating with their vendors and suppliers?
Yeah, I think, you know, what John had mentioned, that there are differences between IT and OT, but I think that there are disciplines that we can apply from an IT cyber perspective into the OT environment. You know, the hygiene and being able to understand and know the assets that you have. I just had a great conversation with Bob just earlier about that. And I think where we need to be is recognizing and understanding the OT technologies and seeing how we can take advantage of that. Cybersecurity is really about knowing what you have, knowing what should be normal activity, and knowing what should be anomalous activity. Being able to understand, the sensors and the various systems that we have within our OT environment, understanding what is normal in those environments, being able to correlate that with other activities that are happening outside of that, that secured wall, will help us to paint a picture of what is actually an important item or not. But there is one data point that I wanted to share with you I thought was interesting. We talk about the risk of OT and OT cyber. In 2022, IBM X-Force reported that there was an increase by 2,204% increase on reconnaissance against internet-connected SCADA devices. So clearly, there is an understanding of what we do and the importance of what we do, and how that could impact operations, not just our operations, but national security, human lives at stake. So you asked a question on how do we work with our suppliers? What can we do? I think that the supply chain risk is another piece. That it's a known risk. I mean, we have NERC-CIP regulations that specifically talk about supply chain. There are regulatory requirements that we have to follow to ensure that we are vetting things that we are putting in our environments. But I think in addition to that, partnering with our vendors and our suppliers is extremely important. So again, I go back to your cybersecurity 101. You want to make sure that you have the right access. If you give them access, you want to make sure that they go through jump posts. You want to make sure that you vet their access and whatever country that they're in, making sure that you've reviewed the laws that are required for that. So all that aside, you really want to make sure, we want to make sure that you are working with your vendors and making sure that there are requirements, making sure that there are contractual requirements on breach notification, making sure that you can be at the table when there is a design question that could impact the security of your systems. It is about partnership, and it is about understanding that it is no longer an isolated topic. And it's much more than just regulatory requirements. And I've seen that occurring. I know that, we've worked with the national labs that are engaged in reviewing, certain chips and things like that to ensure that the viability of the security is there. But if you look at from a risk perspective, and I've mentioned this because I've been doing this for a couple of decades now, and I've mentioned this way before, which is if I were a hacker, I wouldn't go just for your system. I would go to whoever supplies your security system. So if we take a look at, for example, SolarWinds is another hack that occurred not too long ago, where it was an attack on the vendor that does the monitoring for many companies, government, private sector, public sector, many companies. That's where we need to be. That's where we need to be focused on and ensure that we're partnering with.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, because I think you made some very good points there. When we look at the motivations behind some of these threat actors, a lot of the motivation is going up. It's beyond just monetary. It's the leverage that you can place. Like a utility is a very attractive target if you think about it. So not only do we supply and power the banking, the network, the communications, it's something that is beyond just the pocketbook of the utility that you're tapping into. It's everything that the utility supplies and powers. So really leveraging and looking at what some of these other industries, like what is the banking industry doing to secure its networks, and how do we leverage and tap into that knowledge base and apply it to the utility, but also making the vendors and the suppliers part of the answer in the solution chain, because we're all in this together. So if the utility goes down, we all go down together. So they're all there needs to be sort of skin in the game from all of us in solving this problem.
Carol, I want to ask you, and let's shift gears a little bit and talk more about the organizational level, other sides of the business. Let's say HR, for example. How has the process affected them, and how do they impact the IT-OT convergence? And how do we build effective staff and teams to meet the needs of this convergence?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about, you know, the threat actors and the IT/OT convergence. But if you look at, you know, all of the examples that we've been giving here, whether it was the solar winds or the attack on the Ukrainian grid, IBM did a study recently and equated 95% of the security breaches that have happened in all industries can be traced down back to a person. It's us that's the weakest link in the chain, right? So when you look at, you know, the role HR has to play in this piece of the puzzle here as well, is it's really building in and training in a security or a culture of security into the organization, because we're all part of the link in the chain, if you will. So, you know, I like to think about, you know, security. It's typically annoying. Like, I don't know how you feel about getting a notice from your IT department that it's time to change your password, and your password has to be, you know, 14 characters, has to have a special character in it, has to have, you know, an uppercase and all of that, and you have to change it every 6 months. So, you know, we push ourselves into the situation where it is such a complex world to make ourselves hyper secure that we look for ways around it. So, you know, we write our password down and we stick it to our laptop. How secure is that? So, you know, people will look for ways around requirements and security if you make it too frictioned for them. So if you make it too difficult. So really HR and operations have to look for a way that, you know, you do have a frictionless security environment that is putting as much, you know, security and rigor and disciplines in place as possible. We are never going to be, and this is the uncomfortable part of the conversation, we are never going to be 100% secure. It's an impossibility. You know, whether it's from a physical attack or a cyber attack, there will always be vulnerabilities. Our goal really is to raise the bar to such a level that the cost or the return on that attack is not as attractive. So it's all about, you know, points and balances, checks and balances. But HR has a critical role to play here in really educating everybody about the cost of not having a culture of security, of being the weakest link in the chain. And, you know, Anne was talking about the relationship with the supplier and the vendor and the customer. That is also part of the chain here, and the piece of the puzzle is that we all need to be aware that if it's our software that has created a vulnerability point that has allowed access into the utility or the utilities customers, and that trickle down security breach approach, we all need to now be held accountable for that. And that's part of the national security threat level being increased by the Biden administration, is to have that hammer and that, you know, carrot or stick or whatever you want to call it, but having that lever that we can all be held accountable. So, you know, we all need to do the best we can to make sure that our systems, our business processes, and our HR training has that security culture embedded in it.
Thank you. John, I want to go back to something that you said, that we work or operate in silos. Obviously, that's a big challenge, and there needs to be more collaboration inside the organization and among organizations also in the industry. So how do we break those silos and create collaborative work environments and systems of accountability and standardization?
So great question. So in any kind of barrier breaking, silo reduction kind of effort, it goes down, it really starts, as Carol was saying, with the people, right? So we all build up our little fiefdoms. I remember in my time at LCRA when we got approval to run the first VAT scans inside of power plants. The chief engineer, who turned around, but I'm not gonna name him, came running into his boss and said, "I heard you're gonna let IT guys into the plant." He said, "Well, first of all, they're not IT guys, they're cybersecurity people, and they're also not all guys, but yes, I'm gonna let them in the plant." "Why are we gonna do that? You can't trust IT guys around the plant." He says, "Well, why?" "Well, they're gonna break the power plant. He said, I looked at my colleague, who was a great partner, and said, I looked at him and I said, have you ever broken the power plant? Well, sure. Then what makes them different from you? And we had to start breaking down those silos person by person, leader by leader, to say we're all in the same team, we're all in the same business here. Let's get to know each other. Let's work together. It requires a lot of listening too. There's a lot of people who go to a meeting and you've got 3 or 4 groups. Maybe it's compliance and regulatory and your plant operations or your T&D folks or your substation or distribution. They go to a meeting and that group, whether it's 3 or 4 people, all hears things the same way. They all say things the same way. And we've got to start adopting more of a listening and learning attitude to say, I know everyone else who's been an electrical engineer their whole lives thinks that what you just said is ridiculous, but I'm going to ask a few more questions before I assume it actually is ridiculous. And the other way around. And so the other piece, which I'll take the opportunity to make a shameless plug for the Electric Grid Cybersecurity Alliance that I just launched in November, is to partner with folks. You can join that, or you can find other ways to just meet people and just talk and build relationships. Everybody's super busy, right? And on top of all the things you got to do during the week, sitting down and taking somebody out to lunch, it doesn't seem like it's going to make it to the list, but make the time. We had a really hard time getting OT environments to do the patching that they could do until some of the folks from the cybersecurity group just started taking people out to lunch, driving out to their offices and finding a location that was near them and sitting and having tacos with them for a little while. And I think that relationship building, that team building is really the key to getting the technology stuff done. There was one meeting like that where we had been trying to get a certain team to do patching for 6 or 7 years. No, 6 or 7 months. Sorry, 6 or 7 months. We've been trying to get them to patch. One guy took him out to lunch and it was all patched before he got back to the office. And it just shows that it's not, you're dealing with people. You're not dealing with spreadsheets.
Bribery always works.
And that's right. That also works.
Yeah, I would just add to that, we are all people, right? And we talk about, technology, whether it's operations or IT technology, but it does come down to understanding the business processes and the why, the change management of it. And I talked about, that culture of security, if you make it too onerous or frictioned in deploying some of these without understanding how you're impacting their business processes and how they're trying to do their job, which is just as important in keeping the lights on and the grid up. But it does come down to understanding the why. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you forcing me to change my password? Why does it have to be a different pattern than I used the last 7 times I changed my password? So if you really understand that, walking a mile in someone else's shoe and why they're doing that, you're much more likely to embrace that change that's being inflicted on you.
That's right.
We have about 15 minutes to the end of the session, so I want to open the floor for questions from the audience before I go on with the questions for our speakers. So do we have any questions here? No?
We have a
Okay.
room of cybersecurity
Question here.
experts.
Do we have a mic, Alec, or? Okay, I'll repeat your question.
So it sounds like large scale generation cybersecurity is obviously you guys are looking into that and updating it. But my question was what about customer owned solar generation? Who covers I guess the cybersecurity on that end? And I guess I can use Hawaii as an example. When you guys are 40% the generation is solar.
Renewable, yeah. I mean, on Kauai, it's 95%.
Down to 20% of that is rooftop solar.
Rooftop
owned by
distributed
customers.
solar, correct.
How do you protect that system that's controlled by Wi-Fi that's easily remotely, I guess, can be remotely hacked? How would you guys protect something like that?
So the question for the recording is, how do we protect customer-owned solar generation systems?
I'll take a crack at that. So no one can do it themselves, but there's a set of people that can do that together. And this is a nice advantage of now being neither officially in a utility or in a service provider. So I can say the thing that they both want to say but won't say. They we need to start having conversations together to learn from each other on the utility side and the technology service provider side to talk about how we tackle problems like that. So how do you build in security requirements? The utilities are a great source of what the requirements should be. They could be a big part of that conversation, but it's those equipment manufacturers that need to implement them. So they've got to hear from the utilities saying, here's the kinds of use cases or threat vectors we're worried about, and here's the kinds of things you can do to protect against it. The tech vendors, whether it's solar panels or inverters or any other one, or control systems for that matter, they can fix this stuff, and they have the ability to fix this stuff, but they also need our support on the utility side to advocate for the higher cost that comes associated with that. So I've heard a lot of technology vendors, and I use that term loosely to mean anybody that makes a product that we buy in the utility space, control systems on down to Nest thermostats, where they say, we heard from y'all that you wanted more security, we built it in, and then we went to an RFP, you chose the cheaper guys that don't have that. So, we're either going to take it out, or some of them will actually go try to get regulation passed. None of that's efficient. The right answer is we've got to start having a conversation with each other. All those folks are out there, especially at the consumer, DER side. They're all out there racing to market, trying to get the lowest price possible. The utilities have to have a public statement that says this is the minimum security requirements that we're willing to accept. And if you don't meet them, we're not going to allow them in our environment. That takes the pressure off somebody to say, you're not going to go convince an average consumer that they've got to spend $400 more for your thermostat because yours is supposedly secure because the vendor said it. But if the utility says, we're going to use these vendors and you can't use these others, that's an easy choice. So it's a tough one because we've got to work together.
Yeah, I think you make great points, and I would just add to that, like, I don't know how many were in the previous session except the gentleman that was on the panel, but one of the things they were talking about is the disruptive, what does the nature of the new grid look like, and the disruptive nature of DER and the distributed resources, and I believe it may not happen in our lifetime, but it's happening. And it'll continue to accelerate is the fact that the utility is transitioning into a service provider, a grid as a service, if you will, and are more and more getting involved in managing what would typically be behind the meter or the customer responsibility. If you have a two-way grid that's operating and it not only is a generation source but is also a security concern, the utility has to step up and mandate, these are the minimum security specs of that piece of hardware that you're connecting into the shared grid, because now you have created a shared risk profile as well that we all pay the price for because of somebody's insecure smart thermostat or smart refrigerator that's connected to the thermostat or what have you, right? It's all interconnected.
Thank you. Any more questions before we move on? Yeah.
Great conversation. Really love hearing your insights as change makers. My name is Raphael. I work at Entergy, and we're a private utility broadband provider, and I was on the utility side 3.5 years before. So my question is, what have you seen in terms of the cultural change within the utility side when it comes to physical and cyber security deployments? Just curious to hear your insights on the change you may have seen in the last, let's say, 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, I mean, I
I'm
would.
sorry, can you repeat the question? So what has the cultural change been in the past 5 to 7 years with regards to technological changes, you said? Physical and cybersecurity changes.
Yeah, I think that there's a greater understanding of that cyber-physical convergence. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier, is that these systems, these sensors, it's all digitized. And because it's digitized, then there's an understanding that there is a risk to that. So cyber-physical systems is interesting because if you really think about the evolution of OT, start out as just this OT. It's supposed to be air-gapped and all by itself, and then you add networked aspects to OT. these Ethernet cables sticking out in the back of these, control systems. And so then you throw in firewalls and DMZs and diodes and things like that. And where we are now is that cyber physical system, because there is such a dependency on the two. If we take a look at some of the, again, going back to some of the prior hacks, a cyber hack that then impacted a system, system in a physical way. And so the nuclear attack, for example, that cyber hack caused the system to rotate so quickly that it basically smoked. I mean, it caused physical damage. I think with what I'm finding is that there's a much greater understanding and appetite. So, as I mentioned earlier, I've been doing this for a couple of decades, and now there is actually a welcoming of cybersecurity to these discussions, to projects where we may be creating greater opportunity for our customers and for ourselves, but introduces risks from a cyber physical system perspective. And a greater maturity. I think that there's more systems that are coming into play that will further enhance that type of integration. We recognize that it's needed. It's not just a something that we can ignore anymore.
Speaking of culture, actually, I was going to direct. I think you were going to speak about it. So we're going to talk about the culture of risk averse or culture of caution in the industry. So could you tell us if we're keeping pace with the needs for convergence and the requirements, the cybersecurity requirements of that process?
Yeah, I mean, utilities get a bad rap for being slow moving, risk adverse. I think frankly, personally, that's a good thing, because nobody wants to take risk with something that is such a essential service. However, when we are talking about things that are moving so fast, there is the threat profile and the new actors that we're seeing emerging, and frankly, the weaponizing of access to the energy grid requires a little bit more of a fast-moving response from a cybersecurity response perspective. So I think we are seeing changes happen. Whether it's within the utility itself, standing up alliances and having teams focused within the organization internally, looking at that culture of security, whether it's from HR, operations, from IT. But we're also seeing it from the vendor community as well. So, as I said earlier, we're all in this together. So certainly at IFS, we're standing up, teams that are focused on nothing but looking at security threats of our software. Not just penetration tests and bug defects, but looking at how we can improve and harden when we are deploying software that's connected to things behind the DMZ, or we become a vulnerability point. We recognize that. So how do we become part of the discussion with our customers and with the IT security experts? But I also see a movement or an acceleration of cloud adoption. So a lot of the utilities looking at and recognizing that maybe they are not the experts in cybersecurity, and taking advantage of some of the people, whether it be Microsoft or Amazon or Google, pick your favorite flavor of the cloud, where they're investing billions in this technology and hardening, a shared environment. And we do have to either look to the banking industry, look at the telecom, look at the cloud hosting providers, and go to that best of breed and embrace and adopt that.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? David?
Probably getting that back at John, but so we look at all kind of things that happen in our city. I mean, if I wanted to disrupt the city now, knowing what I do know about utility safety measures, you kind of made me think a few moments ago about all the silos that still exist. And I probably wouldn't go after utility distribution. But if I could get Alexa on, Alexa off, Alexa on, Alexa off throughout that city, I could severely screw up your distribution network, and you probably wouldn't know about it. Have those conversations started yet?
So that is an important kind of threat vector to look at. And there are some areas, like we were mentioning with Hawaii, where there's a sizable enough percentage of your generation that's DER at a certain point that you might be able to disrupt the grid. That's not as high of a risk right now that I'd prioritize for two reasons. And one statement, although I just made a very reassuring statement, I have to follow it with a less reassuring statement. It's actually harder to hack all of those people's home Wi-Fi than it is to hack the utility. So if you think about a bank, right, if a foreign threat actor said, I want to mess with the financial system in the US, I'm going to steal everybody's money. It's hard. It's not impossible, but it's hard. You got to break into a whole bunch of banks and a whole bunch of different networks that are all broken, all managed in different ways. And it takes a long time to do that. And if you don't hit them all simultaneously, you don't achieve your objective. The problem with us in utilities is we're large and centralized. So it's a very good threat vector to think about, and we should be working on it. But I'm more concerned, I think, with the utilities themselves. Right now, you have to be pretty smart or an insider to know how they work. So big nation states, the kind of big four sort of cyber actors, have penetrated or tested a lot of the networks. Utilities know how this stuff works. But that security we get from the fact that people don't know how stuff works doesn't last that long. My friend Emma Stewart, I'll credit with the great analogy that every zombie movie has this scene when the zombies get smart. The zombies haven't gotten smart on this yet, but it's just a matter of time. Once people start saying, hey, we saw this with physical security, right? Once somebody said, I know where I can shoot in a substation, suddenly you saw a bunch more. So
Yeah, we're out of time, but I want to give you like final remarks, all of you, like in 30 seconds or less. What's your outlook for the near future on this topic, cybersecurity and IT and OT convergence, and just final remarks? Anne, let's start.
Yeah, well, I wanted to add to John's commentary. First of all, John is the real deal, and his consortium is right on. But I wanted to add to that this notion of security by obscurity, or they don't know what we do. It changes. If you ever use ChatGPT, ask it a question. Ask it to create something really, really bad for you, phish or malware. That's the future. And so I know we're talking about IT-OT convergence. There's still some simple stuff we still need to do. People still need to use MFA. They still need to implement better passwords, not click on those phishing things, not click on those smishing things on their phones. But on top of all of that, of decades of just normal cyber hygiene, now we've got AI. Now we've got actual AI that we've got to battle with. And so that's something that I want y'all to think about from a risk perspective and where you want to, focus some of your investments and time.
Great point.
I'm going to return Anne's compliment by reminding the audience that she was the first chief security officer at ERCOT and the first person to unite cyber and physical security. So also an amazing person who knows her stuff. So I'll leave you with this thought. I ask, in the new work that I'm doing, I ask utility CEOs a lot of times the same question, where I say, do you feel like you have a successful employee safety program, the OSHA stuff? And they all say, yes, I do, which is good answer. And then I ask them, is it impossible anyone could get hurt? It's not impossible. Then why do you feel like you have a successful program if it's still possible that someone could get hurt? And what they usually say is this: I know what the components of a good program are. I know that we do them, and I know that we're monitoring to make sure that if we ever slack off, we're going to notice before the problem starts to happen. That's the goal with cybersecurity. You're not going to be perfect, and it's achievable. We're never going to eliminate injuries as much as we'd like. We're also never going to eliminate hacks. Our goal is to get to where, when we ask ourselves, do you feel like you have a successful cybersecurity program? Do you know what the components are? Do you know you're doing them? And do you feel comfortable that if you slacked off, you'd notice? That we'd say yes. And that's doable. It's not, a lot of the problems we're talking about, solving here are much harder than that. It's very solvable.
Thank you. Carol, final thought.
Yeah,
few
it's hard to
seconds.
follow those two class acts and come up with something new. But I would say that I'm constantly amazed about the amount of effort and talent that gets thrown into cyber attacks. Like people, if they applied that to, putting a man on Mars, we'd already be there decades ago. So I'm just always shocked and amazed by that. But it is something to be aware of, and whether it's AI or just human innovation and investment, it's something that we need to be aware of and constantly be evolving and adapting to. Because as John said, and as I said earlier, we're not going to get to 100% secure. It's just not physically possible, whether it's physical or cybersecurity. There's always a better mousetrap. There's always someone hungrier for what you have than you are to protect what it is. And we're always responding to. So I would continue to, come to conferences like this, come to other security industries and learn what can be done, share knowledge across, and really build, with your supplier, your vendor, your organization, whoever, a culture of security, because it is very important.
Thank you so much, and thank you for joining me in this discussion. Appreciate it. And thank you all for sitting through this heat. I really appreciate it.